Hello and welcome to another summary of what we looked at in church this morning in Ballymagurney. Last week there was no summary because it was our harvest weekend, and we had a very good weekend. The Lord blessed us, but we're coming back again this Sunday, back to our study in Joseph. We want to think about chapter 41 today, Genesis chapter 41, and this is our seventh study, and we want to think this morning about the theme from the prison to the palace. From the prison to the palace. In this chapter, Joseph, he leaves the prison and he is launched straight into the palace to be the right-hand man, essentially, of Pharaoh. Genesis 41, we'll just read verse 14 to you, which sums all this up. Verse 14 we read, "Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh." The story of Corrie ten Boom is a very good story, very interesting story. Corrie ten Boom was essentially a Dutch lady. She was a Christian, and she helped house and hide Jews during the Second World War. However, she was discovered and she was placed in a prison, a concentration camp in the north of Germany. And towards the end of the Second World War, she was then released from her prison camp, and she was miraculously released because just 10 days later, as she recounts in some of her biographies or some of her books, 10 days after she was released, all of the ladies who were in her concentration camp or prison, they were killed. Obviously, she was spared. She was miraculously let out 10 days prior to that. This is what she said concerning the events of her release from prison. She said this. She said, "I still do not understand all the details of my release. Floods of tears came over me, over my soul. As I thought about Revelation chapter 2, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it." As she was going through the prison, as she was leaving that prison, as the doors, as it were shutting behind her, she said she still didn't understand all of the details surrounding her release from prison. But nonetheless, God had opened the door. And I believe Genesis 41, Joseph would have been feeling exactly the same. Remember Joseph, we saw a few weeks ago, he was in prison, and yes, there was some pluses to be gained from his prison experience. There was capital to be had out of disaster. But at the same time, Joseph, he now is being released from prison, and he couldn't have explained all of the details as to why he was being released, but nonetheless, God was opening the door, and no man was going to shut this door. The time had come for Joseph's release from prison. Joseph, he could have been kept in prison for the rest of his life. But God intervened. That's what I want you to see at this stage. God intervened. God, he undertook. He saw Joseph in his prison. And not a moment too soon and not a moment too late, God, at the right time, he intervened. And he opens the door just like he did with Corrie ten Boom. And Joseph, in an instant, is plunged from the prison to the palace, to be the prime minister, the governor of Egypt, the right-hand man of Pharaoh himself. And child of God, there's a wonderful encouragement in this. In the midst of your prison experiences in life, your dungeon experiences, whatever they may be, things can change in an instant. God, he intervenes. He intervenes in an instant. And you see this throughout the Bible. When was it that God shut the lions' mouths? It was whenever Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. Not a moment before it. Not a moment after it. Just right when God needed to step in and intervene, he shut the lion's mouth. When was Christ in the fiery furnace? He was there whenever Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego were thrown into the furnace. He was not there before they were thrown into the furnace. He was there with them as they were thrown in. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus Christ had concentrated the early part of his ministry in Capernaum. All of a sudden he decides to head to the city of Nain. Whenever he heads to the city of Nain, there's a widow who loses her son. And in Luke 7 verse 11 we read, as Christ enters the city of Nain, he then intervenes and he raises that widow woman's son to life. He didn't go to Nain before he died. He went just as he died. He intervened at just the right moment. So beloved, be encouraged today that Christ sees you just like Joseph. He sees you in the prison, and in his time he grants a release. He grants an intervention. God is the sovereign over your trials, over your affliction, over your adversity, and therefore he intervenes, not a moment too soon and not a moment too late, just at the right time. And we can say with the psalmist that as for God, his way is perfect. And this is what we see here in Genesis 41 as Joseph is promoted from the prison to the palace at the end of this chapter. So I'll just draw a few lessons from this chapter 41 today, under the heading, as we've said, from the prison to the palace. The first lesson that I think we see here concerning Joseph as he's promoted is his patience. His patience. In verse 1 of chapter 41, we simply read that it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. A few weeks ago, we learned that Joseph was in prison, but he wasn't alone. He was there with the butler and the baker. And you remember what Joseph did. He interpreted their dreams. And in verse 14 of chapter 40, Joseph, he tells the butler to do something. He tells him after he's exonerated, after he is elevated back to his position in 3 days, he tells him to remember me when it's well with thee. In other words, when you get out of prison, don't forget about me. I'm still languishing here in prison. Yeah, the baker, unfortunately, he's going to pass away, but whenever you get out of prison, remember me. But unfortunately, the butler doesn't do that, doesn't keep to his promise. In verse 23 of chapter 40, we read that he forgot Joseph. He forgot all about him. And then all of a sudden, Pharaoh has a dream. In fact, he has 2 dreams. And at this stage, the butler then remembers. He remembers Joseph. It all comes flooding back to his mind. As one man put it, the cobwebs are taken away from him, from his mind, and he remembers. He remembers Joseph. Now, Joseph spent 2 years in this prison. Perhaps he felt that he was abandoned and even forgotten by God. And yet all the while, God was teaching him patience as he languished there in prison, as he felt forgotten, forsaken even by this butler. God saw him, and God was teaching him the lesson of patience. Patience through his trial, patience through his adversity, patience through his suffering. And this would stand him in good stead as he served the Lord as the Prime Minister of Egypt for decades to come. He was going to need patience as he dealt with people and as he dealt with all of the problems of the 7 years of famine and the 7 years of plenty and so on. He was going to need that patience, and God here was bringing him into the school of patience and teaching him a lesson through his delay from being released from prison. Child of God, the Lord does this. Sometimes he permits a problem or a trial or a difficulty to go on, to be prolonged, to teach you patience. Hebrews 13 tells us, ye have need of patience. We all have need of patience. And God takes us and he takes you to the school of patience, and he does this through adversity, through a prolonged affliction. There are various reasons as to why God permits difficulty in our lives, but one of the reasons for it is that God teaches you the lesson of patience. Wait. Many times you read that word or that phrase in the Bible, wait on the Lord, be of good courage. The psalmist, Psalm 40, I waited patiently for the Lord and he inclined unto me. Waiting time is never wasted time. It teaches you patience. You do a search on that word patience. You will find this, that it's intimately connected with the thought of affliction or trials in the Bible. James chapter 1, for example, tells us that the trial of our faith worketh patience. Verse 4 tells us we are to let patience have her perfect work. James chapter 1 again. What does the trial of our faith do? Adversity, it works. In the Greek, it produces, it fashions patience. Again, the book of Romans and the chapter number 5, we read there that tribulation worketh patience. Again, similar theme to James 1 there. What is God doing in the midst of your affliction? Well, whenever it's delayed, he is teaching you, look, wait on me, as he was teaching Joseph, teaching you to be dependent upon him, for him to sustain you, for him to be present with you during this prolonged affliction. And again, we can think of COVID, and we can think even in our own land, there is a delaying of the thing, that there's no getting away from that. Perhaps God's teaching the Church of Christ in general, and you specifically, the lesson of patience. Patience. Remember hearing about a little boy, and he was standing at a shopping centre at the top of one of those automatic lifts or elevators, escalators they'd be called in America. He had spat his chewing gum on the escalator, and obviously it was going round and round and round. And he was just standing there at the top of the stairs, and he was looking at the stairs. And a sales assistant from a shop came over to him and said, "Son, is everything okay?" He was just staring there blankly. He said, "Yes, everything's fine. I'm just waiting on my chewing gum. Just waiting my chewing gum." And you know, whenever you go through a prolonged period of affliction, a delay, perhaps even like Joseph, there's the tendency to be like that young lad, isn't there? Just to stare at the thing. And just to look at it. Just to be so absorbed by it and taken by it. Yet all the while, God is teaching you patience, as he was teaching Joseph patience here, when he was forgotten by the butler. Joseph's patience. And when you see secondly here, in terms of being promoted to the palace then from prison, Joseph's power. His power. In chapter 41 and verse 38, Pharaoh exclaims this concerning Joseph: "Can we find such a man like this, a man whom the Spirit of God is?" In this chapter, what essentially happens is, as I've said, Pharaoh, he has a dream, 2 dreams. You probably know the dreams well. First of all, he sees 7 well-fed cows, fat cows if you want to call them that, and 7 thin cows, or lean kine as they're called here in Genesis 41. And in this dream, he sees the 7 thin or lean kine eat up the larger cows. His second dream is very similar. He sees 7 full ears of corn on one stalk, and he sees 7 wilted and withering ears of corn on the one stalk, kind of dying. And these 7 ears of corn that are wilted and withering, they also eat the 7 good ears. He doesn't know what it means. And all of a sudden, the butler, he remembers Joseph. It's God remembering Joseph. But here's the butler, he remembers Joseph, that he had interpreted their dreams in prison, how he had predicted that in 3 days the butler would be elevated and the baker would sadly be exterminated. And it all came to pass. And so Joseph comes and he interprets the dreams. And he essentially tells Pharaoh this. He tells him that there's going to be 7 good years of crops and so on, and then there's going to be 7 bad years. But the wonderful thing about this is that Joseph doesn't stop there. Because from verse 31 onwards, you read that Joseph does something. Not only does he stand before this Pharaoh who, let's not forget, he's the Pharaoh and Joseph's just a prisoner and he's just 30 years of age. Yet he also suggests to Pharaoh the way out of this difficulty, the way out of this national calamity. He tells him that he is to save 20% of the crops during the 7 good years, and he is then during the 7 bad years to give that, to dispense that to the populace of Egypt. He also tells him that he is to get someone who is wise to oversee this whole project, this next 14 years of of maintaining Egypt, so to speak. And in doing this, then Pharaoh responds. Can we find such a man, verse 38, as this, a man whom the Spirit of God is? What I want you to see is this. The lesson is this, is that things suddenly change for Joseph. They dramatically and almost instantly change. One minute he's a prisoner, the next minute he's in the palace, and he's telling Pharaoh how to handle this national calamity. This man who has ruled Egypt for a long time. Joseph's a slave. He's been imprisoned. And yet he is now standing before Pharaoh, interpreting dreams, and essentially telling him how to run his jurisdiction. What I want you to see is that God not only intervenes in the circumstances of Joseph, but he then gives him the power or the grace to face those changing circumstances. He gives him wisdom. He endues or he infuses the Spirit of God into Joseph and gives him God-given ability to deal with the situation. There's many lessons we can learn from this chapter, but I want to focus in on this because sometimes when God intervenes and that brings about a huge change of circumstances, sometimes we feel all alone. Sometimes it can be a promotion, like Joseph, for example. Sometimes we can be in an affliction. All of a sudden the Lord delivers us from that affliction, that prison, that experience, whatever it might be. And sometimes we just can't face the change of circumstances. We almost get used to things being bad. Whether it's a promotion or a prison experience, God, he intervenes and he gives you the Spirit. He gives you wisdom. He gives you grace to deal with those changing circumstances. Child of God, you recently just had a promotion. Sometimes this can happen in work. Sometimes it can even happen in church. You're taken from the background to the foreground. There's a change in circumstance in the family, at work. There is a certain and a sudden change, and you feel that you just can't deal with it. Joseph was a slave and a prisoner one minute, and he's now in the palace the next. And God not only gives him the ability to interpret these dreams, but also to suggest a plan to the very Pharaoh himself. And Pharaoh sees it's the Lord. It is the Lord. Be encouraged today, beloved. Whenever you face that sudden intervention of God, that sudden change of circumstance, that sudden deliverance from affliction, that sudden promotion, whatever it might be, God has promised he would be with you. Think of Joshua. Joshua had spent years in the background, just watching Moses lead the people of God through the wilderness. All of a sudden, Joshua chapter 1, Moses dies. He passes away. Joshua 1 verse 2, Moses my servant is dead. In verse 5, God comes to Joshua, tells him, you're going to be the successor of Moses. And he tells him this, I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Joshua, I'm going to be with you. Here's a sudden change. You've gone from the background to the foreground. God intervenes in the life of Joshua, in the life of his people in general. Joshua, I'm going to be with you. As you lead the people into the promised land, I'm going to be with you. What encouragement there is today for you then, child of God, as things change, as there's sudden changes, as there's sudden interventions from the Lord's with you every step of the way. He gives you his peace. He gives you his presence, gives you the power, even that others can sometimes see. Sometimes you feel that you just haven't the wisdom, you haven't the ability. It's a good thing, because God then, he is bringing you low to show you, look, you need me here. And he does indeed grant that grace. So Joseph, his patience and his power. Lastly, I want you to see his promotion. Joseph is wonderfully promoted here. After he gives the interpretation to Pharaoh, the meaning of the dream, he is then, and this is the wonderful thing, he suggests that to Pharaoh that he should get somebody to oversee this. Pharaoh says, well, you're the man, Joseph. And Joseph is then promoted almost instantly from a prisoner to the prime minister. And in verse 42, Joseph is given certain things. He's given a new ring for his finger. He's given a new robe. He's also given a chain around about his neck. And the thing that really strikes me about Joseph, as you read on through the book of Genesis, as we're going to see in the coming weeks, is this. Promotion doesn't destroy Joseph. Joseph has proved the Lord in 13 years of adversity. He's 17, he's a shepherd boy, now aged 30. He is promoted to Prime Minister. Joseph has proved the Lord in adversity, but now he's proving him in prosperity. Over the next 80 years of his life, Joseph would live in prosperity. He would be in that elevated position. He would be in Egypt, a very powerful nation. Most powerful nation of its time. And if you read Genesis 41 onwards, nothing bad is said about Joseph. There are no blemishes on his character. It seems that he keeps his eye on the Lord when things are going bad, and he also keeps his eye on the Lord when things are going well. Child of God, this is a good lesson to remember. Whenever you're promoted, when things are going well, in the years of plenty, as well as the years of famine, remember the Lord. Joseph proves the Lord in his family life, as we're going to see next week. He shows himself to be a wise and discreet individual. It doesn't go to his head. Whenever God intervenes and God blesses and God furthers and promotes, 1 Peter tells us we are to humble ourselves, or James 4 tells us we're to humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God, and he will exalt us in due time. It's one thing to be humble, it's another thing to stay humbled. Someone put it this way: it's better to stay humble than be humbled. And Joseph here, he stays humble. Whenever he's promoted, he continues to walk with God. From the prison to the palace. May the Lord bless his word to your heart this afternoon.